Easter holidays came and went, and the summer term began at school. My grandmother and I had already planned to take our summer holidaying in Norway, and we talked about almost nothing else. Every evening, she had booked a cabin for each of us on the boat from Newcastle to Oslo at the earliest possible moment after my school broke up. And from Oslo, she was going to take me to a place she knew down on the south coast near Arendal, where she had spent her own summer holidaying as a child nearly 80 years before. All day long, she said, my brother and I were out in the rowing boat. The whole coast is dotted with tiny islands, and there's nobody on them. And we used to explore them and dive into the sea off the lovely, smooth granite rocks. And sometimes, on the way out, we would drop the anchor and fish for cod and whiting. And if we caught anything, we would build a fire on an island and fry the fish in a pan for our lunch. There is no finer fish in the world than absolutely fresh cod. What did you use for bait, Grandmama, when you went fishing? Mussels, she said. Mussels are kind of like oysters. Everyone uses mussels for bait in Norway. And if we didn't catch a fish, we would boil the mussels in a saucepan and eat those. Were they good? Ooh, they were delicious. Cook them in seawater, and they're tender and salty. What else did you do, Grandmama? We used to row out and wave to the shrimp boats on their way home, and they would stop and give us a handful of shrimp each. The shrimps were still warm from having just been cooked, and we would sit on the rowing boat peeling them and gobbling them up. The head was the best part. The head? I said. You squeeze the head between your teeth, and you suck out the inside. It's marvelous. You and I will do all those things this summer, my darling, she said. Grandmama, I said, I cannot wait. I simply cannot wait to go. Nor can I, she said. When there were about 3 weeks of summer term left, an awful thing happened. My grandmother got pneumonia. She became very ill, and a trained nurse moved into the house to look after her. And the doctor explained to me that pneumonia is not normally a dangerous illness, but because of penicillin, it's usually okay and curable. But when a person is more than 80 years old, like my grandmother was, it's very dangerous indeed. He said he didn't even dare to move her to the hospital in her condition, so she stayed in her bedroom, and I hung out outside the door while oxygen cylinders and all sorts of other frightening things were taken into her. Can I go and see her? I asked. No, dear, the nurse said, not at the moment. A fat and jolly lady called Mrs. Spring, who used to come and clean our house every day, also moved in and slept in the house, and Mrs. Spring looked after me and cooked my meals, and I liked her very much, but she wasn't a patch on my grandmother for telling stories. And one evening, about 10 days later, the doctor came downstairs and said to me, you can go in and see her now, but only for a short time. She's been asking for you. I flew up the stairs and burst into my grandmother's room, and I threw myself into her arms. Yeah, it's really scary for him if anything would happen to Grandmama, right? Hey there, the nurse said. You be careful with her. Will you be all right now, Grandmama? I said. The worst is over, she said. I'll soon be up again. Will she? I asked the nurse. Oh, yes, the nurse said, smiling. She told us she simply has to get better because she has to look after you. I gave her another hug. They won't even let me have my cigar, she said, but you wait till they're gone. She's a tough old bird, the nurse said. We'll have her up and about in about another week. And the nurse was right. And within a week, my grandmother was thumping around the house with her gold-topped cane and interfering with Mrs. Spring's cooking. I thank you all for your help, Mrs. Spring, but you can go home now, she said. Oh, no, I can't, Mrs. Spring said. The doctor told me to see that you take it very easy for the next few days. Well, the doctor said more than that. He dropped a bombshell on my grandmother and me by telling us that on no account were we to risk the journey to Norway this summer. Rubbish, my grandmother cried. I promised him we'll go. It's too far, the doctor said. It would be very dangerous, but I'll tell you what you can do. You could take your grandson to a nice hotel on the south coast of England instead. The sea air is just what you need. Oh, no, I said. Do you want your grandmother to die? The doctor asked me. Never, I said. Then don't let her go on a long journey this summer. She's not yet strong enough. And stop her smoking those vile black cigars. In the end, the doctor had his way about the holiday, but not the cigars. Rooms were booked for us in a place called the Hotel Magnificent in the famous seaside town of Bournemouth. Bournemouth, my grandmother told me, was full of old people like herself. They retired there by the thousands because the air was so bracing and healthy, and it kept them, so they believed, alive for a few extra years. Does it, I asked. Of course not. She said, it's Tommy rot, but just for once I think we'll go and obey the orders of the doctor. So soon after that, my grandmother and I took the train to Bournemouth and settled into the Hotel Magnificent. It It was an enormous white building on the seafront. It looked to me like a pretty boring place to spend a summer holiday in. I had my own separate bedroom, but there was a door connecting my room with my grandmother's room so we could each visit each other without going into the corridor. And just before we left for Bournemouth, my grandmother had given me as consolation a present of 2 white mice in a little cage, and of course, I took them with me everywhere. They were terrific fun, those mice. I called them William and Mary. And in the hotel, I set out right away teaching them to do tricks. The first trick I taught them was to creep up the sleeve of my jacket and come out at my neck. So here it is. He's teaching this mouse to go up the sleeve of his jacket, like the arm of his jacket, and then come out where his neck is. He really loves his mice. Then I taught him to climb up the back of my neck onto the top of my head, and I would do this by putting cake crumbs in my hair. And on the very first morning after our arrival, the chambermaid was making my bed when one of the mice poked its head out from under the sheets, and the maid let out a shriek that brought a dozen people running to see who was being murdered. And I was reported to the manager, and there followed an unpleasant scene in the manager's office with the manager, my grandmother, and me. And the manager, whose name was Mr. Stringer, was a bristly man in a black tailcoat. "I cannot permit mice in this hotel, madam," he said to my grandmother. "How dare you say that when your rotten hotel is full of rats anyway?" my grandmother said. "Rats?" Mr. Stringer said, going mauve in the face. "There are no rats in this hotel." "I saw one this very morning," my grandmother said. "It was running down the corridor into the kitchen." "That is not true," said Mr. Stringer. "You better get a rat catcher in at once," said grandmother, "before I report you to the public health authorities." So here's Grandmama, and she's talking to Mr. Stringer, who's the head of the hotel. He wants her to get rid of those mice. "I expect there's rats scuttling all over the kitchen floor and stealing food off the shelves and jumping in and out of soup." "Never," said Mr. Stringer. "No wonder my breakfast toast was all nibbled around the edges this morning," my grandmother went on relentlessly. "No wonder it had a nasty, ratty taste. If you're not careful, the health team will be ordered to close down the entire hotel before everyone gets typhoid fever." "You are not being serious, madam," Mr. Stringer said. "I have never been more serious in my life," my grandmother said. "Are you or are you not going to allow my grandson to keep his white mice in the room?" Well, the manager knew that he was beaten. "May I suggest a compromise, madam?" he said. "I will permit him to keep them in his room as long as they are never allowed out of the cage. How's that?" "That will serve us very well," said my grandmother, and she stood up and marched out of the room with me behind her. Well, there's no way you can train mice inside of a cage. Yet I dared not let them out because the chambermaid was spying on me all the time. She had a key to my room, and she kept bursting in at all hours, trying to catch me with the mice out of the cage. She told me that the first mouse to break the rules would be drowned in a bucket of water by the hall porter. I decided to seek a safer place where I could carry on with the training. There must surely be an empty room in this enormous hotel. I put one mouse into each trouser pocket and wandered downstairs in search of a secret spot. The ground floor of the hotel was a maze of public rooms, all of them named in gold letters in the doors, and I wandered through the lounge and the smoking room and the card room and the reading room and the drawing room, and none of them was empty. And I went down a long, wide corridor, and at the end of it came to the ballroom. And there were double doors leading into it, and in front of the doors there was a large notice on a stand. And it said, "RSPCC meeting, strictly private. This room is reserved for the annual meeting of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children." Well, the double doors into the room were open, and I peeped in, and it was a colossal room, and there were rows and rows of chairs all facing a platform. And the chairs were painted gold, and they had little red cushions on the seats, and there was not a soul in sight. First of all, check out that door. This is how enormous this hotel is. That door is huge. And there's going to be a meeting in there, and you can see the sign, right? You can see the sign that says the RSPCC. It's reserved for the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Must be a lot of nice people, right? I sidled cautiously into the room. What a lovely, secret, silent place this was. The meeting of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children must have taken place earlier in the day, and now they'd all got home. Even if they hadn't, even if they did suddenly come pouring in, they would be wonderful, kind people who would look upon favor with a young mouse trainer going about his business. I knew they must be nice. And at the back of the room, there was a large folding screen with Chinese dragons painted on it, and I decided, just to be on the safe side, to go behind the screen and do my training there. I wasn't a bit frightened of the prevention of cruelty to children people, but there was always a chance that Mr. Stringer, the manager, might pop his head around the door. If he did, and if he saw the mice, the poor things would be in the hall porter's bucket of water before I could shout stop. So I tiptoed to the back of the room and settled myself on the thick green carpet behind the big screen. What a splendid place this was, ideal for mouse training. I took William and Mary out of my trouser pocket, and they sat beside me on the carpet, quiet and very well behaved. The trick I was going to teach them today was tightrope walking. It is not all that difficult to train an intelligent mouse to be an expert tightrope walker, provided you know exactly how to go about it. First, you must have a piece of string. I had that. Then you must have some good cake. A fine currant cake is the favorite food of white mice. They are dotty about it. I had brought with me a rock cake which I had pocketed while having a tea with Grandmama the day before. Now here's what you do. You stretch the string tight between your two hands. But you start by keeping it very short, about 3 inches. And you put the mouse in your right hand and a little piece of cake in your left hand. And the mouse is therefore only 3 inches away from the cake. He can see it. He can smell it. His whiskers twitch with excitement. He could almost reach the cake by leaning forward, but not quite. He only has to take 2 steps along the string to reach this tasty morsel. He ventures forward, one paw on the string and then the other, and if the mouse has a good sense of balance, and most of them have, he will easily get across, and I started with William. And he walked the string without a moment's hesitation. And I let him have a quick nibble of the cake just to whet his appetite, and then I put him back in my right hand. And this time I lengthened the string, so instead of 3 inches, I made it 6 inches. William knew what to do now, and with superb balance he walked step by step along the string until he reached the cake. He was rewarded with another nibble. Quite soon, William was walking a 24-inch tightrope. That's like if you put 2 rulers together. If you put 2 rulers together, that's 24 inches, because 1 ruler is 12 inches. So he was walking a long string across to the other hand. From one hand to the other to reach the cake, and it was wonderful to watch. He was enjoying himself tremendously. I was careful to hold the string near the carpet so that if he did lose his balance, he wouldn't have far to fall, but he never fell. William was obviously a natural acrobat, a great tightrope walking mouse. So that's how he does it. And here's Mary down there too. So you see Mary and you see William, the 2 mice. Now it was Mary's turn. I put William on the carpet beside me and rewarded him with some extra crumbs and a currant. And then I started going through the same routine all over again with Mary. And my blinding ambition, you see, my dream of dreams, was to become one day the owner of a white mouse circus. I would have a small stage with red curtains in front of it, and when the curtains were drawn apart, the audience would see my world-famous performing mice, walking on tightropes, swinging from trapezes, turning somersaults in the air, bouncing on trampolines, and all the rest of it. I would have white mice riding on white rats, and the rats would gallop furiously around and around the stage. I was beginning to picture myself traveling first class all over the globe with my famous white mouse circus. Wow, I'd be performing in front of all the crowned heads of Europe. And I was about halfway through Mary's training when suddenly I heard voices outside the ballroom door, and the sound grew louder, and it swelled into a great babble of speech from many throats, and I recognized the voice of that awful hotel manager, Mr. Stringer. Help, I thought. But thank heavens for the huge screen. I crouched behind it and peered through the crack between 2 of the folding sections. I could see the entire length and width of the ballroom without anyone seeing me. Well, ladies, I am quite sure you will be comfortable here, said Mr. Stringer. And then in through the double doors he marched, black tailcoat and all, spreading his arms wide as he ushered in a great flock of ladies. Now remember, he's hiding behind a screen in the back. If there's anything we can do not hesitate to let me know, he went on. Tea will be served for all of you on the Sunshine Terrace after you've concluded your meeting. And with that he bowed and scraped himself out of the room as a vast herd of ladies, they must have been from the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, came streaming in. And they wore pretty clothes, and all of them had hats on their heads. Now that the manager had gone, I was not particularly alarmed. I mean, what better than to be imprisoned in a room full of these splendid ladies? And if I ever got got to talking to them, I might even suggest that they come and do a bit of cruelty to children prevention at my school. We could certainly use them there. In they came, talking their heads off, and they began milling around and choosing their seats. And there was a whole lot of stuff like, come and sit next to me, Millie dear. Oh, hello, Beatrice. And I haven't seen you since the last meeting, and what an adorable dress you have on. And I decided to stay where I was and let them get on with their meeting while I got on with my mouse training. But I watched them for a while longer through the crack in the screen, waiting for them to settle down. How many were there? I guessed about 200. The back rows filled up first. They all seemed to want to sit as far back from the platform as possible. And there was a lady wearing a tiny green hat in the middle of the back row, and she kept scratching the nape of her neck, the back of her neck. She couldn't leave it alone. It fascinated me the way her fingers kept scratching away at the hair on the back of her neck. Had she known somebody was watching her from behind, I'm sure she would have been embarrassed. I wondered if she had dandruff. All of a sudden, I noticed that the lady next to her was doing the same thing. And the next one. And the next. The whole lot of them were doing it, and they were all scratching away like mad at the hair on the back of their neck. Did they have fleas in their hair? Got them all scratching. Maybe they had lice. Nits. A boy at school called Ashton had nits in his hair last term, and the matron had made him dip his whole head in turpentine. It killed the nits all right, but it nearly killed Ashton as well. Half the skin came away in his scalp. And I began to be fascinated by these hair-scratching ladies. It's always funny when you catch someone doing something rude and they think no one's looking. Nose picking, for example, or scratching your bottom. Hair scratching is very nearly as unattractive, especially if it goes on and on. I decided they must have lice. But then the most astonishing thing happened. I saw one lady pushing her fingers up underneath the hair on her head, and the entire head of hair came up in one piece, and the hand slid underneath the hair and went on scratching. She was wearing a wig. She was also wearing gloves. I glanced swiftly around at the rest of the now-seated audience, and every one of them was wearing gloves, and my blood turned to ice. And I began to shake all over, and I glanced frantically behind me for a back door to escape through, and there wasn't one. Should I leap out from behind the door and behind the screen that I'm hiding behind and make a dash for the double doors? Those double doors were already closing, and I could see a woman standing in front of them, and she was bending forward and fixing some sort of a metal chain around the door handles. Keep still, I told myself. No one has seen you yet. There is no reason in the world why they should come and look behind the screen. But one false move, one cough, one sneeze, one nose blow, one little sound of any sort, and it won't be just one witch that gets me. It'll be 200. And at that point, I think I fainted. The whole thing was altogether too much for a small boy to cope with. But I don't believe I was out for more than a few seconds, and when I came to, I was lying on the carpet. And I was still, thank heavens, behind the screen. And there was absolute silence all around me. And rather shakily, I got to my knees and peered out once again through the crack in the screen. So again, giving you a little preview of next time, but that is, this is not the page. This is the crack in the screen. So remember, he's behind a screen, and he can just kind of see out through the crack what's happening in this huge room that he's in. Not looking good for him, is it?